Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. My name is Adrian Goldberg. This time, Tufton Street, the Tories, and how to buy influence in British politics. We're going to hear from journalist Peter Gagan, author of the best-selling book Democracy for Sale, and the Byline Times political editor Adam Bienkoff. Peter has written a couple of brilliant pieces recently on his Substack about how key supporters of a group of supposedly independent think tanks based around 55 Tufton Street in London have poured more than £5.5 million into Rishi Sunak's coffers since he replaced Liz Truss as Prime Minister in October 2022. These think tanks themselves have received millions from other Tory backers. Nigel Vincent, for example, a Liz Truss supporter, gave £3.7 million to one of these think tanks, the Institute for Economic Affairs, in 2023. Meanwhile, Adam has exposed how Tory MPs gave backing in Parliament to a pothole repairing machine made by another Tufton Street and Conservative supporter, the JCB tycoon Lord Bamford, without declaring any interest. So it's a whole nexus of connections, of influence. Let's unpack it. First with Peter. So, Peter, you've written a couple of pieces about this. The first one was about the amount of money going from the think tanks, or at least from their key supporters, into Rishi Sunak's campaign fund. So talk me through that first, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for having me on the show, Adrian. And, I've had an interest in these think tanks for a long time. I've been very interested in the extent to which these are groups who don't declare their donors. I think that's such a fundamental point. These people do not say where their money comes from, and they haven't in the past. And they've had a huge influence on our politics. We have loads of meetings with ministers. You see them on Question Time. You hear them all the time.
And we're talking about groups like the Institute for Economic Affairs, the Centre for Policy Studies, Policy Exchange.
The IEA, the CPS, Centre for Policy Studies and Policy Exchange, are probably the three big behemoths of the kind of think tank world. They supply people that you've heard of on the radio, on the TV, and also they're very close to government ministers. And as we saw with Liz Truss, they basically, as in the words of Tim Montgomery, the Conservative commentator, the IEA, the Institute for Economic Affairs, had incubated Liz Truss. From the minute Liz Truss went into Parliament, she was very close to the IEA. She used to have weekly meetings at Lord North Street, where the IEA's office, just around the corner from Tufton Street. So these are really influential groups. And one of the things that struck me looking at them, I started to do a big research project with my colleague Lucas Amin, and we started looking at it. And one of the things that really struck me was if you looked at the people who run these think tanks, their directors, their trustees, advisors, they use different names, but essentially the people in charge of these think tanks, a lot of these people are very senior Conservative donors. So take the CPS, the Centre for Policy Studies. That was set up about 50 years ago by a guy called Keith Joseph. The architect, really, of Thatcherism in many ways was Keith Joseph. Immortalised actually in a John Cooper Clarke song, if you're so minded.
I think the line was, a baby died and Keith Joseph cracked a smile from John Cooper Clarke.
That's exactly it. Well done, Adrian.
From Beasley Street, I think it is. It's a great poem.
It's a brilliant poem. And it really encapsulates this kind of uber-libertarian, very right-wing view of the world. And if you look at who's running CPS now, the chair of the board is Lord Michael Spencer, who's given more than £7 million to the Tories. Anthony Bamford, who Adam's been writing about recently, is on the board. So is Graham Edwards, a Tory treasurer. Similar things you will see at Policy Exchange and at the IEA. And what we did was look at this and go, actually, how much, let's think about this, to what extent, because we've often seen Tufton Street says they're independent. Well, actually, what happens if you actually look at who runs these things? And we were able to see that more than £35 million had gone from the people who were the trustees on the day Liz Truss crashed the economy in 2022. So these are the people who were backing her in 2022, have given to the Tory party. Almost all these people are still there. And then I was also very interested in thinking, well, Rishi Sunak says that Truss was wrong. He's tried to distance herself from Truss. He's not Liz Truss. Well, actually, these people have also given him a hell of a lot of money, over £5 million. And curiously, just to take one example, is a guy called Graham Edwards. Graham Edwards runs a big property company. He also has a big stake in a water company in Scotland. He's a very rich man. Graham Edwards gave £50,000 to Liz Truss for her campaign. So clearly he was a big fan of her in 2022. Just a few months later, when Sunak came into office, who did he turn to make Tory party treasurer? Graham Edwards. Graham Edwards has raised about £50 million for the Tories since then, and himself has given more than £4 million. And what is this showing? These are big numbers, and it sounds like lots of numbers. But what effectively you can see is that these groups who are seen as supposedly independent, who've actually had a lot of influence in our politics over the last few years, especially since Brexit, the people running these organizations are big Tory donors. And at the same time, these organizations are supposed to be seen as kind of independent. And it begs a real question. And then the next story we did actually showed that a lot of these Tory donors who are on these boards are also actually funding the think tanks. And I think what it really shows, I think it really does explode the idea of independence, because if you have a bunch of people who are funding a political party and are also directors or very close to these think tanks and are funding them too, at what point does the political donation stop and the support for the supposedly independent think tank begin?
And a staggering statistic about the amount of appearances by these various Tufton Street related think tanks in British newspapers or the online equivalents. It was more than 15 times a day. I mean, it's astonishing. So these organizations, which, as you say, are held to be independent, or they're quoted often to substantiate or to comment on particular stories, the evidence would suggest that they're anything but independent, but that is how they're posited. Their spokespeople often get interviewed, for example, or invited onto shows like Question Time as independent commentators. They're not, are they? They're not.
And the influence on policy has been huge. You know, this was a part of a bigger project that I think we planned to do during the summer, where we would have had a bit more time to the election comes and you move as journalists, but to really try and trace the policy trail around some of these guys. Because what you've got, it's the conveyor belt is remarkable. It really is a revolving door between think tanks and government. You know, we've had dozens of SPADs at this point who've gone from these think tanks into government, particularly under Liz Truss. Liz Truss' entire administration basically was from think tanks. You had a senior person from Taxpayers Alliance as her chief economic advisor. You had people from the former policy exchange staff, IEA staff. You know, this was a real conveyor belt, but it's by no means just Truss. There was a huge influence on specific policies from these think tanks that we've seen, especially over the last 5 years. And Truss's entire mini budget, all those different huge tax cuts, they were all completely incubated in places like the IEA. And very interesting, if you look who backs these organizations, if you look at these directors as we did, these big Tory donors, what's the thing that unites them all really? What they want is tax cuts. What they want is to pay less tax and less state, because they're very wealthy people who will do very well from paying less tax.
I think it's worth saying one of the people that has come from these think tanks and gone into government is Rishi Sunak himself, who previously worked as the head of Policy Exchange's Black and Minority Ethnic Research Unit. And shortly before he called the general election, he gave this big flagship speech about his vision for the country. And he chose to give it at Policy Exchange in front of a backdrop full of essentially an advert for Policy Exchange itself. Policy Exchange staffers have worked in Downing Street, and Sunak has confirmed that Policy Exchange helped draft laws, its draconian sort of anti-protest laws. So he's absolutely right. There's this complete revolving door between what happens in Tufton Street and what happens in government. And there's just no real transparency about exactly what those relationships are. And often these people end up in the media as well. We're talking about the amount of appearances on Question Time. I was invited onto LBC a couple of years back, and on the panel with me was IEA staffer Emily Carver, and I asked her to declare where her funding came from. Got into a big barney with her over that, but she's since left the IEA and gone on to work for GB News. Kate Andrews, another IEA staffer, has now gone on to work for The Spectator and interviews politicians. So there's a real kind of incestuous relationship between these organisations and actually what happens in our media and in politics as well.
Yes, and I think the important takeaway, Peter, is that you've got these very wealthy donors who donate significant sums of money to the think tanks and occupy senior positions on the think tanks. Then they also donate significant sums of money to Tory ministers, to the Tory Prime Minister, and yet these organisations are presented as independent. And I know that there was a question raised about whether their charitable status could actually hold, given that they've given 500 times more to the Conservatives than they have to the Liberal Democrats, and they've never donated any money to the Labour Party. I mean, it's ridiculous that they might be presented as independent in any way, but independence is part of the key to their charitable status.
Yeah, it's a big aspect of this, the charitable status of these organizations. So they have actually technically what's called a duty to consult with all major political parties. So to kind of give a fair hearing to everybody else. And as you say, the stats that we were able to produce looking at their donations suggests a very, very clear direction of travel in one way only. And the other thing I think is really important as well, I think when I first started looking at this, looking at think tanks, writing about them, I wrote my book about them. It was before we knew the full extent of the COVID scandal and the COVID contract scandal and the relationship between donors and party. And I think we know a lot more about that than we did before. We know that the party listens to its donors and it listens to what its donors want. And if you can imagine a donor who's also, say, the chair on the board of one of these think tanks, that becomes a very powerful voice. And the extent to which we know these kind of kitchen cabinet conversations go on, we know this sort of lobbying goes on between the leaders group of Conservative donors. You give £50,000 a year and you get to go and have 4 off-the-record dinners with the Prime Minister and senior cabinet ministers where, nothing is minute and nothing goes down. Well, imagine what it's like for these sort of super donors. People like Anthony Bamford who are giving north of £9 million to the party. These people get a huge in. And so the extent to which the kind of policies that come out of these think tanks are able to influence government. And in some ways, what I also find remarkable about it is Liz Truss should have been the end of these guys, really like that. It's hard to think of a more, when their policies, which never really change, there's not a lot of thinking that goes on in these tanks. Once they hit air, they completely combusted. And rather than kind of that being the end for them, we had Mark Littlewood, who was the head of the IEA. He said that he compared it to making a pizza. If you go to a restaurant and you have a bad pizza, you don't blame pizza as a dish, you blame the chef. Interestingly, Mark Littlewood now works for Liz Truss. He's the head of the Popular Conservatives, who some of your listeners will have heard of. So we're talking about a huge revolving door with a small number of characters who really have exerted an unbelievable amount of influence on
And when
our
you talk
politics.
about that influence, Peter, sorry to cut across you, but I think it's really important to make this point again, because the fact is there in your articles that Tufton Street think tank staff had more than 150 meetings with Conservative ministers since 2020. So this is not theoretical influence. This is gaining access, getting to speak to key people on issues as various as post-Brexit trade agreements, free ports, and so on. Adam, I want to talk about your story about Bamford, because it involves Jonathan Gullis, deputy chairman of the Conservative Party.
That's right.
I mean, a figure that many people on social media would regard as I think a figure of comedy, quite honestly. But he and another colleague in Parliament have been bigging up this Pothole Pro, which may well be a fantastic bit of kit to deal with potholes, which was made by the Conservatives' old friend, Lord Bamford. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I think it says a lot about the state of the current Conservative Party that Jonathan Gullis has been made deputy chair, but I think that's a matter for another discussion. But anyway, yes, I mean, the Conservative Party over recent years has become increasingly reliant on a small number of very wealthy donors. And we've heard a lot in the past couple of weeks about Frank Hester, who's donated millions of pounds to the party, despite making absolutely disgusting comments about Diane Abbott. But one of their other big donors who has donated millions of pounds to the party is Lord Bamford and JCB. And as we revealed on Byline Times this week, this support does appear to have been reciprocated by the Conservative Party. Our investigation found that Conservative politicians have repeatedly promoted this product, the Pothole Pro, which has been bought by a number of Conservative councils around the country that cost hundreds of thousands of pounds each. Bamford and JCB have donated huge amounts of money to the party nationally, also to individual Conservative MPs. So they donated £10,000 to Jonathan Gullis shortly after he had, in Parliament, spoken at length about the virtues of JCB and Pothole Pro and this revolutionary product, as he described it. Also, another Conservative MP, Theo Clark, also received £5,000 from JCB and also promoted it on Facebook. We've had numerous photo opportunities by Conservative MPs and ministers with the Pothole Pro, including the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, who also spoke in Parliament in favour of the Pothole Pro, in favour of JCB. We put this to Mark Harper, and in a statement, he said He didn't receive a personal donation from JCB, but of course, he's a senior figure in the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party received a lot of money from them. He said there are no rules stating that we need to declare donations to the party, just to us as individual MPs. But obviously, if a company is giving millions of pounds to a political party, that is going to benefit individual MPs in their re-election, etc. So I think that is a definite hole in the rules there.
Yeah, no rules broken. Let's be absolutely clear about that. But it does beg a question about the rules, the fact that there doesn't have to be any declaration of that sort. I think the Pothole Pro was even being paraded outside Downing Street, wasn't it?
There was a JCB machine outside Downing Street, and JCB has been a sort of regular feature. Boris Johnson has given speeches in front of JCB factories. So there is this kind of reciprocal relationship between the Conservative Party and one of its largest donors, and it's just rarely discussed by any media organisation. And I just think for it to be so blatant, for MPs to be essentially advertising the product on social media, in the press, and even in Parliament, and for this not to even be declared when they make these comments, I think is really a scandal that needs further investigation.
Yeah, and one other thread that I mentioned, that Peter's research had shown that Tufton Street think tanks were mentioned more than 15 times a day in the last year by newspapers. I mean, that's an incredible statistic, but one of the most receptive outlets for Tufton Street stories is the Telegraph. And on Byline Times, our colleague Josiah Mortimer has revealed that the Telegraph has been pushing what appear to be anti-Labour adverts via Meta, via Facebook. So again, this kind of web of connections on the right, really pushing a Tory agenda. And there has been a shot across the bows of the Telegraph by the Electoral Commission over this.
Well, there's always been this sort of story that journalists tell ourselves, that there is this firewall between political parties and media organisations. And if that were ever the case, it certainly isn't now. And as we've seen from Josiah's report this week, the Telegraph started posting these adverts all over social media. They've reached millions of people. And there are real questions raised by it as to whether this amounts to third-party campaigning, because these are supposedly independent media organisations. And so they're not regulated in the same way that political parties are launching campaigns are regulated. Josiah spoke to the Electoral Commission about this, and they said they didn't believe that this constituted campaigning. However, they did say that they had reminded the Telegraph of their need to follow the rules. So essentially a sort of shot against the bows. And this isn't the first time the Telegraph has been caught up in this kind of activity. Back in 2015, they were fined £30,000 by the Information Commissioner for sending unsolicited emails to hundreds of Telegraph readers on the eve of the general election, urging them to vote for the Conservative Party. So, this is a serious issue. These outlets are meant to be independent media organisations, not classified as being part of the Conservative campaign, but they are able to spend, essentially limitless amounts of money and can class it as being journalism rather than what it appears to be, which is political party campaigning.
No, I think it's a huge issue. I think, and if you look at even beyond that, if we can see what with Paul Marshall and GB News, effectively GB News is not a traditional business in the sense that anyone would understand a traditional business has been in the business of trying to make money. It is a loss-making venture with, almost no route to profitability that looks apparent to anybody at the moment. And it is paying massively, it was before the election, over the odds for Conservative MPs to appear on it. Jacob Rees-Mogg was on £350,000 a year. That is not the market rate for Jacob Rees-Mogg on TV. And on what point do they become political donations? And obviously we know about Paul Marshall wanting potential to take over the Telegraph. And I think this election is really flagging just how party political these organs are. And if you look at what they are pushing, they're pushing a series of very, very distinct and very, very aligned narratives, very kind of, I guess, reform-friendly narrative to the right of the Conservative Party. And the way in which our election laws are not able to deal with that has become really, really stark. These are all things that we knew. What's remarkable as somebody who's been in the space for a while is that there's been a series of really good recommendations from people like the Commission on Standards in Public Life, boring sounding august organizations and which are cross-party, have come up with recommendations for all this stuff. The problem was the government of particularly the last 5 years, hasn't wanted to do anything about it. And instead, it's actually made our electoral regulations worse. They've watered down our electoral regulations. They've taken away the independence of the Electoral Commission. And that has created a situation, I think, in which you can see the likes of the Telegraph can make merry hay because there's almost no threat of real sanctions behind it.
There is a question, isn't there, about funding more generally about political parties. I mean, people might point to the significant financial donations made to the Labour Party by the trade union movement. And I know that Dale Vince, who previously funded Just Stop Oil, he's a green energy tycoon. He's announced that he's going to donate millions of pounds to Labour. So, I mean, Labour also has people donating money to it, whether it is trade unions, whether it is individuals, to whom it will presumably feel some level of obligation going forward if it becomes the government of this country.
Well, this is a huge problem, I think, in general with how we do our politics. You know, we have decided a political system that runs on private money. And so it creates a situation in which everybody's scrambling after donors and scrambling after cash. And I think there's a wider problem. And again, you're talking about, we've had a series of cross-party committees over the last 14 years have recommended things like caps and donations of, say, £10,000. The public, no doubt, would really want to see things like that. We saw new figures this week about trust in politics and being at an all-time low, and money's had a huge role to play in that. You know, the COVID scandals and all the rest of it had a huge role to play. And there's a question about, you know, our unwillingness to think about things like public funding, which I always think is really funny in Britain, because we actually do publicly fund our parties. Parties get lots of money from the public purse. They get short money for having seats in parliaments and all sorts of legislature. So we do already do that, but we just don't want to talk about it in the same way that we don't want to talk about capping donations. Labour talked really good on this sort of stuff a few years ago when, you know, in the first COVID cronyism story started breaking, and frankly, Labour were 20 points behind the polls. They were talking really tough on cleaning up politics, and we've heard a hell of a lot less about that more recently.
It definitely is an issue for Labour. I went to the Labour Party's conference last year, and there was a lot more of these kinds of organisations, a lot more of the think tanks paying for stalls, paying for big events, having senior Labour MPs appearing as the guests at these events on the panel. There is not the equivalent on the Labour side of a whole sort of network of think tanks supportive of the Labour Party. However, that is starting to develop. So there is one group called Labour Together, whose senior figures within are very close to the Labour leadership and have helped write a lot of the policies that are in the Labour manifesto. And some of the senior figures have gone on to become advisors to Keir Starmer. So I think this is not something that's going to go away once we no longer have a Conservative government, even if it's not as a developed a phase within the Labour Party and the Labour movement as we have seen over the last years in the Conservative Party.
This one, as they say, will run and run. Thank you very much indeed. Well done on a fantastic investigation, Peter, and well done on your work as well, Adam. If you want to follow Peter's work, just put Peter Gagan Substack into your search engine and you will find it. We would always encourage you as well to follow Adam Bienkov, who runs his fantastic Substack Folded. And if you want to support this podcast, I know there's a lot of demands on you, but if you do want to support this podcast, please consider taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. It is our brilliant monthly newspaper which combines the best of our online offerings with content that you can't read anywhere else. Head over to bylinetimes.com to take out a subscription. All worthy outlets and far better than the mainstream outlets that really don't run these kind of stories. And just one little reminder for you as well, bylineaudio.com is now up and running, offering Byline Times Live with Peter Jukes and Hardeep Matharu, offering Utter Bollocks with Otto English and John Mitchinson as well. So do head over and look at some of our new online offerings at bylineaudio.com. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been a We Bring Audio production for Byline Audio and the Byline Times. We'll see you again very soon, but for now, thank you. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.